When we think of Genghis Khan, visions of unstoppable armies, rivers of blood, and cities burned to the ground come to mind. But there's a hidden side of this Mongol emperor that history rarely whispers about, a side more intimate, more horrifying, and more depraved than the battlefield. Behind the tents and yurts of his vast empire, Genghis Khan's personal life was ruled by fear, obsession, and domination. He treated marriage, concubines, and even his closest companions as extensions of his absolute power. Women were not partners. They were trophies, instruments, and, at times, weapons of psychological terror. Even those closest to him trembled at his whims, never knowing whether they'd be caressed or coerced, honored or humiliated. The very intimacy that should have been private became a weapon of control. What you're about to hear will shatter every romanticized notion of love in history. This is the terrifying story of domination, obsession, and the most intimate abuses of power in the empire of Genghis Khan. When the world thinks of Genghis Khan, they imagine unstoppable armies sweeping across Asia, leaving entire civilizations in ruins. But behind the sweeping plains and the relentless conquests lay a private world that was even more terrifying one, that few historians dared to fully record. This was the world of his intimate life. The women, concubines, and even family members who lived under constant scrutiny, fear, and the relentless will of a man who equated dominance in the bedroom with dominance of an empire. Genghis Khan's power was absolute. Every citizen, soldier, and servant understood that to displease him in private was as dangerous as defying him in public. Within the sprawling tents of his encampments, the emperor maintained an inner court, a private harem of wives and concubines numbering in the hundreds. But this was not simply a collection of women. It was a system meticulously designed to enforce obedience, loyalty, and terror. Women were examined not just for beauty, but for potential influence, family alliances, and, above all, for their ability to remain subservient. A glance considered disrespectful, a hesitation in speech, or even a misaligned posture could invoke fear of punishment that ranged from public humiliation to severe physical retribution. The emperor's first wife, Birde, provides one of the few glimpses into the paradoxical world he created. She was both his partner and an instrument of power, her loyalty cemented through threats and rewards alike. Historical accounts suggest that Genghis monitored the relationships between his wives carefully, ensuring none grew too close to each other in ways that might threaten his dominance. He exercised an obsessive control over intimacy, dictating not only the actions of the women themselves, but also the behavior of any guards, aides, or servants who interacted with them. Obedience became an enforced form of worship. Intimacy itself was a theater of psychological control. But it was not only the women who suffered. Men in Genghis Khan's inner circle, including his sons and trusted generals, were often coerced into participating in or observing acts designed to reinforce hierarchy and submission. The emperor's intimacy, unlike that of a private man, was public in the sense that it served a political and psychological function. Fear became ritualized. A general might watch as a favored concubine performed obedience tests, understanding that any misstep could reflect not on her alone, but on him as her sponsor. In this way, Genghis Khan blurred the line between private and political power, making every act of intimacy a lesson in obedience. The emperor also had a calculated approach to virginity and purity. Young women were often selected from conquered tribes, not simply for beauty, but for their familial value. Virgins were considered especially desirable because their submission was untested, a blank slate for absolute control. The first night a new concubine entered his private chambers was an event shrouded in ritualized terror. Observers, usually trusted eunuchs or loyal attendants, sometimes remained close, ensuring compliance and reporting disobedience. Genghis Khan's power in these moments was absolute. Refusal or hesitation was interpreted as rebellion and could be punished immediately, serving as a warning to all others. Psychological manipulation was as important as physical control. Some women were placed in situations that forced them to witness the emperor's intimate interactions with others, creating jealousy, anxiety, and a constant sense of inadequacy. This cultivated dependence and fear, ensuring that his wives and concubines would not only obey him but also police each other's behavior, reducing the need for direct oversight. Loyalty, in this system, was manufactured through terror, and affection was often a tool for control rather than a genuine emotion. The emperor's dominance extended beyond touch. It was mental, emotional, and omnipresent. But Genghis Khan's obsession with control was not limited to adult women. In some cases, he exploited alliances through arranged marriages between his male relatives and young women from subjugated tribes, securing loyalty while maintaining a network of fear and dependence. These relationships were seldom loving. Instead, they were carefully calculated maneuvers that ensured the emperor's influence reached into every household in his expanding empire. Even within these orchestrated unions, his presence or influence lingered, shaping the lives and minds of those he touched. Compliance was not an option, it was survival. Witness accounts, though limited and often filtered through later historians, hint at the extremes of his intimate practices. He reportedly required certain concubines to live in isolation, deprived of outside contact for months, then summoned them to his chambers for unpredictable visits. The sudden shifts from isolation to enforced intimacy created psychological strain so severe that some women reportedly collapsed under the weight of expectation and fear. Others adapted, learning to anticipate his moods, the rhythm of his desires, and the rituals that surrounded them, effectively becoming extensions of his will. Resistance, however subtle, could result in brutal punishment, sometimes witnessed by the rest of the harem as a stark reminder of the cost of defiance. Even within his family, intimacy and fear were intertwined. Sons who challenged him politically or expressed independence risked physical retribution or social exile. The emperor's sexual dominance was mirrored in his familial control. A son's loyalty was as much about political strategy as about obedience to a father whose private actions were a constant display of power. In this way, Genghis Khan's most terrifying intimate practices extended far beyond the bedroom. They were instruments of governance, fear, and empire building. Each act reinforced the notion that he, alone, dictated both life and death, public image and private desire. And yet, this cruelty had a strategic function. By instilling terror in the most intimate aspects of life, Genghis Khan ensured that no one dared to question him, even within the supposedly sacred bounds of family or court. Obedience became internalized. Women policed themselves and each other. Men obeyed out of fear, and the broader empire witnessed the absolute reach of his control. His personal habits, horrifying as they were, became a lesson in the power of psychological domination. Conquest was not only fought with swords, it was lived and breathed within the tents of his private chambers, where terror and desire converged to maintain his empire. By the end of Section 1, it becomes clear that Genghis Khan's most terrifying practices were not merely acts of physical dominance, but a sophisticated system of psychological warfare. Through intimate terror, he reinforced loyalty, dismantled independent thought, and ensured that fear, not love, became the currency of his inner world. His empire's survival depended not only on his military prowess, but on his ability to extend this fear into the most personal corners of life, shaping a society where even those closest to him could never feel safe, never feel truly free. While Section 1 unveiled the private terror Genghis Khan inflicted within his chambers, Section 2 explores how his intimate practices extended outward. Blending personal obsession with political strategy, his concubines were more than companions. They were pawns, symbols, and tools of empire. Each woman's presence served a dual purpose, reinforcing his dominance at home while binding conquered tribes to Mongol authority. The intimate sphere, far from being private, became a theater of control that extended across Asia, leaving psychological scars on generations. Conquered tribes often had no say in the fate of their women. Young girls, sometimes barely entering adolescence, were selected for their beauty, intelligence, or familial connections. Arrival at the Mongol camp marked the beginning of a new, terrifying reality. Initially isolated, they were observed, tested, and placed into hierarchical groups within the harem. Each group had a ranking determined by favor, lineage, and perceived obedience. Favoritism was not benign. It fostered jealousy, rivalry, and competition, ensuring that each woman's survival depended on absolute compliance. Failure to understand this hierarchy, or worse, to challenge it, could result in exile, brutal punishment, or death. The emperor's visits were unpredictable, governed by whims as much as by desire. Some women would go weeks without seeing him, only to be summoned suddenly for an audience. The anticipation itself became a psychological weapon. Hearts would race, bodies would tremble, and minds were consumed by terror. Witnesses report that the emperor took meticulous note of every reaction. A faltering gaze, a sign of hesitation, or a subtle display of resistance could trigger punishment. Punishments were rarely public executions but calculated private humiliations, designed to reinforce submission while leaving the empire unaware of the horrors within. Women learned quickly that survival required mastering both obedience and performance, internalizing fear as a constant companion. Beyond terror, Genghis Khan leveraged his concubines to create strategic alliances. Marriages between his sons and daughters of conquered rulers were carefully orchestrated. These unions were rarely based on affection. They were political tools that reinforced loyalty and legitimacy. A daughter married into a subjugated tribe served as both an emissary and a hostage, her safety tied to the compliance of her new family. Her intimate life, therefore, became a weapon of diplomacy, a living reminder that the Mongol emperor controlled not just lands and armies, but also the private lives of those who might resist him. Among the inner circle, Genghis Khan exercised control over the sexual lives of his sons and generals as well. While he allowed them to marry and produce heirs, he monitored their choices, often demanding that women within their households adhere to strict codes of conduct modeled on his own. Any deviation, whether in fidelity, obedience, or display of authority, was met with reprimand, coercion, or worse. Sexual domination, therefore, was not limited to women alone. It extended to the social and familial structures of the Mongol elite. Obedience became ritualized, a performance of loyalty that reinforced the emperor's supremacy. Physical punishment in these intimate contexts was both theatrical and precise. Accounts suggest that women who displeased him were sometimes subjected to enforced labor, isolation, or ritual humiliation. One disturbing practice involved public correction of minor errors, where women were made to perform tasks under constant surveillance, their every movement critiqued by attendants. This extended to private ceremonies in which fear, anticipation, and the threat of punishment intertwined with supposed acts of favor or affection. The psychological toll was immense. Women learned that pleasure and terror were inseparable under the emperor's rule. The emperor also cultivated dependency through selective rewards. Those who pleased him, whether through obedience, intelligence, or performance, were granted privileges, slightly better quarters, access to servants, or moments of personal favor. These rewards, however, were never permanent, serving instead to create a cycle of anticipation and anxiety. The concubine who basked in favor one day could fall from grace the next, her body and mind conditioned to constant vigilance. In this way, Genghis Khan ensured that fear remained the primary motivator, while affection, rare as it was, became a tool of control rather than a genuine expression of humanity. Not all women were passive victims. Some adapted to the system, learning the rhythms of the emperor's desires, and leveraging their positions to gain influence or security. These women became intermediaries between the emperor and the larger harem, controlling the flow of information, coordinating duties, and sometimes shielding less favored companions from the full force of his wrath. Yet even these women operated under a shadow of fear. A single miscalculation misreading his mood, failing to anticipate a visit, could erase months of careful maneuvering, demonstrating that under Genghis Khan, even skillful navigation of the intimate world offered no guarantees of safety. The emperor's intimate practices were also infused with ritualistic elements that reinforced his godlike status. Certain ceremonies were held to mark arrivals, promotions, or punishments within the harem. Music, symbols, and elaborate seating arrangements underscored his absolute power. The psychological impact extended beyond those present. Attendants and guards internalized the lessons of obedience, carrying them into their duties across the empire. Through these rituals, Genghis Khan transformed private acts into public tools of psychological warfare, ensuring that fear and submission were ingrained not only in his immediate environment, but across the social hierarchy of the Mongol world. Even within these orchestrated systems, cruelty could be unpredictable. Historical accounts hint at arbitrary acts of terror. A concubine accused of flirting or disobedience could be subjected to sudden isolation, public shaming, or corporal punishment. The unpredictability itself was a weapon those within the harem never knew when the emperor's attention might shift from favor to fury. This constant uncertainty reinforced the lesson that survival depended entirely on anticipating his whims, reducing human relationships to a terrifying game of compliance. By the end of Section 2, the depth of Genghis Khan's terrifying intimate practices becomes unmistakable. They were not merely about sexual conquest or desire. They were instruments of control, psychological domination, and empire building. The women, sons, generals, and attendants all operated under an omnipresent shadow of fear, carefully navigating rituals, punishments, and unpredictable rewards. His private world was a microcosm of his public empire. Absolute authority, terror as a tool, and loyalty enforced through domination. In these chambers, even the most intimate moments were transformed into acts of political control, leaving a legacy of trauma that history rarely fully documents. The consequences of Genghis Khan's intimate practices, the psychological scars, the manipulation of heirs, and the enduring shadow these acts cast across his empire. By this stage, it becomes clear that his personal obsessions were inseparable from the Mongol Empire's political and social structures. Every act of dominance in private reinforced his authority in public, and every terrified gaze or silenced protest became part of the machinery of control that extended far beyond the yurt walls. The women within his harem bore the heaviest burden. Many spent years living under a constant state of vigilance, aware that even a small misstep could result in punishment. Psychological trauma was inevitable. Some chroniclers note that concubines developed hypervigilance, obsessive routines, and ritualized behaviors to anticipate the emperor's moods. Sleep, meals, and social interactions were dictated by fear and the rhythms of his attention. Pleasure and terror became indistinguishable, a constant reinforcement that power and desire in Genghis Khan's world were inseparable. Unlike traditional forms of domestic influence in other empires, his system removed agency entirely, making women both observers and participants in their own subjugation. Even for those who survived years within his inner court, life after Genghis Khan's death did not guarantee liberation. Many of his concubines were reassigned to his sons or close generals, continuing cycles of control. These women, some barely adults at the time of their initial capture, were often married off strategically to solidify alliances. Yet their intimate histories with the emperor marked them for life. The Mongol elite knew that proximity to Genghis Khan, whether as a former favorite or observed participant in his rituals, conferred status but also carried stigma, suspicion, and the weight of trauma. Their survival required constant adaptation, political cunning, and endurance of memories that could never be erased. The impact on his heirs was equally profound. Sons who grew up witnessing or being aware of the emperor's intimate practices internalized lessons in power, fear, and control. They observed that dominance in private, even over those closest to you, was inseparable from political authority. Many of Genghis Khan's sons replicated elements of his methods in governing their own territories, blending intimidation with alliance building, and sometimes perpetuating cycles of abuse within their courts. In this way, the emperor's intimate terror became institutionalized, a legacy transmitted both genetically and socially, shaping the governance style of the Mongol Empire long after his death. The psychological reach of his intimate practices also affected men in the empire beyond his immediate family. Generals, advisors, and tribal leaders learned early that failing to enforce discipline within their households or failing to protect women connected to the emperor could bring ruin. This fear extended across conquered lands. Families knew that disobedience, rebellion, or even perceived disrespect could result in women being taken to the harem or punished. Through these indirect mechanisms, Genghis Khan extended his intimate control into regions he rarely visited, embedding a culture of compliance that blurred the line between domestic life and imperial governance. Historical accounts also suggest that the emperor's practices had a broader cultural effect. His obsession with control over intimate relations transformed social norms within the Mongol court. Concepts of obedience, hierarchy, and fear became intertwined with sexual and emotional dynamics. Rituals that began as personal demonstrations of dominance often became codified, serving as templates for maintaining authority and reinforcing loyalty across the empire. In essence, Genghis Khan's private obsessions became instruments of cultural engineering, shaping how power, intimacy, and obedience were perceived for generations. The empire itself, though vast and militarily dominant, relied on these intimate practices as a tool of cohesion. Fear was a unifying force. It ensured that elites did not challenge the emperor, that conquered tribes accepted subjugation, and that women and men alike internalized the hierarchies imposed upon them. Unlike other historical leaders who relied solely on armies, taxes, or laws, Genghis Khan weaponized intimacy itself. His private actions reinforced public authority, making rebellion not only dangerous, but psychologically unthinkable for those who lived under his gaze. Intimacy became a theater of obedience, a place where his empire's structure was silently rehearsed and reinforced every day. Yet, this legacy was double-edged. While it ensured loyalty, it also produced resentment, trauma, and subtle forms of resistance. Some concubines reportedly found ways to manipulate his moods, protect younger women, or influence decision-making behind the scenes. Sons and generals developed tactics to navigate the pressures of fear without direct confrontation. Even under extreme surveillance, human agency and cunning persisted, though always constrained by the emperor's omnipresent authority. In these cracks, one sees not just domination, but survival strategies forged under extreme conditions, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit amid terror. Genghis Khan's intimate practices also reveal a chilling paradox. His empire was simultaneously strengthened and morally corrupted by these behaviors. On one hand, his control ensured obedience, facilitated alliances, and reinforced the Mongol social hierarchy. On the other, it normalized cruelty, warped human relationships, and perpetuated cycles of psychological harm. The lessons of his private world, fear as a tool, intimacy as leverage, left deep scars on his court and the empire's broader population. Even today, historians studying the Mongol Empire note that while his military campaigns are well documented, the shadow of personal terror shaped the social fabric in ways coins and chronicles rarely capture. The final truth of Genghis Khan's most terrifying intimate practices lies in their totalizing nature. They encompassed women, men, family, and officials. They blurred the line between pleasure and punishment, desire and domination, love and fear. His private life was not separate from the empire, it was an extension of it. Every act of control, every ritualized humiliation, every unpredictable visit reinforced the lesson that he alone dictated the rules of existence. To live under Genghis Khan was to exist in a constant state of psychological submission, where intimacy itself became a weapon of governance. In conclusion, the terror of Genghis Khan's intimate practices cannot be overstated. They shaped the lives of hundreds within his harem, influenced the next generation of rulers, and imposed a psychological order that permeated the Mongol Empire. His private life was a mirror of his public conquests, ruthless, calculated, and absolute. And though centuries have passed, the lessons of fear, obedience, and domination remain a stark reminder that power, when unchallenged, can infiltrate even the most personal aspects of human life. The chilling reality is this: Genghis Khan's empire was not only built on swords and horses, but on the systematic manipulation of intimacy and fear. Women were instruments, sons were observers and inheritors of terror, and even his closest generals internalized a culture of dominance that reached into every household. His legacy reminds us that history's most terrifying figures often wield control not only through conquest, but through the subtle, pervasive, and intimate mechanisms that shape lives without leaving visible scars, yet leave marks on generations that follow. If the hidden truths of Genghis Khan's private life shocked you, there are countless more stories of power, obsession, and cruelty waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and join us every week as we expose the darkest secrets of history.